Great. So my name is Ross Yelsey. I'm Assistant Director of Admission and Marketing here at Columbia Journalism School. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in from all over the world to learn more about our Master of Arts program, Politics Concentration, a great program for experienced journalists who really want to go deeper into political reporting and kind of take the depth of the reporting to new heights. I'd like to welcome two of our core faculty members from the concentration, Professors Nicholas Lemon, Professor Alexander Stilla, as well as a 2022 graduate of the program, Thomas Danielin, who's joining us from the Boston area. So we'll be talking with them for a bit. I know some of you may have some questions, and we're going to have an opportunity to ask them at the end of the webinar. So we'll be talking for a little bit, and then we'll open up the chat so you can ask some questions for our faculty and for our alum at that point. But I think just to get started, for people who might be joining us and maybe haven't looked up the faculty and got an understanding of who teaches in this program, Nick and Sandra, would you like to give a bit of an explanation to them about your own background in journalism and in teaching? Maybe we'll start with Nick.
Yes, I'm getting to the point where I don't want to say exactly how long I've been a journalist, but it's been a really long time. And I mostly have done in journalism, magazine writing and books. I Since 1983, I've been either at the Atlantic or the New Yorker, and then I'm, usually working on a book. And I came to Columbia Journalism School 20 years ago and have been teaching here ever since.
I'm Alexander Stilla, and I worked for a long time as a freelancer doing magazine work and books. I've spent a lot of time living in Italy and reporting overseas, doing kind of longer magazine pieces and books as like Nick. My most recent book was rather unusual, not on an Italian subject, but on something called about an Upper West Side cult, you could say, called the Sullivanians: Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wildlife of the American Commune. I only mention it because in many ways the teaching I've done in the MA program actually helped me think about this rather unusual subject, looking at the sociology of religion, the psychology of groups, and things like that actually really kind of helped me bring that book into focus. Um, so that's what I do, and I've been at Columbia for I think a year or two less than Nick. Nick brought me in when he was starting the MA program.
Mm-hmm. Great. And speaking of the MA program, for a lot of people who come to our website or know the school, you might know a bit about the different programs we have. We have a Master of Science program, and Sandra, you were a graduate of that back when that was the only program really we had at the school. The MS is a great program for people who want to gain, fundamental training in all the kind of professional aspects of doing journalism, whether it's, reporting, writing, and multimedia storytelling, and having the flexibility to also explore different areas of the profession. How does the MA differ from that? And what is it like, how do you approach your teaching in the MA program differently than how you would say for the MS group? And why do you enjoy working in this particular MA program?
Well, I think that the principal difference, as you said, is that we want people who are applying to the MA to have at least a few years of experience. They range in age between 25 and 35, but they all have significant experience so that they know how to report and write stories, and we don't have to then teach them those very sort of basic skills, which frees us up to really focus on ideas and adding depth to their work and complexity, helping them deal with longer stories that require a greater sense of structure. We In some ways, if you think of the MS program as really primarily skills based, and ours, I would say, is more knowledge based. So the big innovation, I think, of the MA program, which Nick really devised, was to take advantage of the fact that our school is located in the middle of one of the great research universities of the world. There are all these really smart, interesting people in these various departments. In the case of politics, it can be sociology, political science, law, economics, anthropology. And yet the work they do is generally inaccessible to a broader public. And so teaching people how to tap into that wealth of knowledge and bring it into their work is really, really, first of all, incredibly fun to teach. I think incredibly fun to the students who are doing it. I've always felt it was like getting paid to go back to graduate school for me. And it's just been a very, very rich experience. But I should point out that all of the writing that students do is journalistic. So we do a deep dive into this other world of research and scholarship. But the whole point is to come back to the surface and do really good journalism, and perhaps to do better journalism than when we started.
Mhm. Great. And Nick, of course, you were the dean that created this program under your tenure at the school as the dean. Can you talk a bit about just your own process of determining that this was a good kind of program to add to what we had at the school at that time, and kind of what your reasoning was behind
Yeah,
that?
well, I just, do a +1 to what Professor Steele just said, but also, I felt another thing he said that I really want to echo is when I was becoming a journalist, this program didn't exist. I feel like I'm sort of secretly a graduate of the program, and the process of devising the program and teaching in it has made me a better journalist and enriches my ongoing journalism. Um, so I guess I felt that as somebody, who had a fairly conventional journalistic training, I knew how to cover a daily news story. And then I would run into more complicated things and feel at sea and confused and unable to deal with it. I felt like my journalistic training didn't help me with things that were either conceptually complicated, that involved understanding the mindset of somebody utterly different from yourself, how to put things into a larger context. So a lot of what we were doing, we were developing this program, is kind of what do we wish we had known when we started in journalism, and ended up sort of stumbling around for years because we didn't have it when we were started. And that's what's in the program.
Great. And Thomas, going to you now, can you tell us a bit about your journey to Columbia? What were you doing before you came to this school? And then when we were looking at all the options we have, how did it, turn out that MA Politics was what you decided to apply for?
Yeah, so I started out as a very junior kind of radio assistant, radio producer over in the UK for a couple of radio stations over there. I did about 5.5, 6, nearly 5.5 years working in various news radio stations in the UK. What I was really looking for is I was looking for a challenge, a place that would really challenge me intellectually. And also I was looking for a place that can help me really break into another market, really expand the world of journalism I can operate in and work in. But I really wanted to kind of hone the skills I already had, because they're pretty raw. I'd had no proper training of any type coming out. I'd worked in student journalism, I'd learned a lot on the job, but I wanted to make my skills official. I wanted to really have an officialness to what I'd learned. I wanted to develop my writing, which was really weak before coming to the course, but most importantly, the politics program really hit my interested areas. I've always been fascinated by looking into politics, global politics especially. It was a very interesting time before coming to the course for me, with Brexit obviously being a big thing for me, EU politics, and all of that, and the syllabus and what I'd heard from other grads of the program really appealed to me. I like the idea of having this very deep dive into history, into politics, into global affairs, why the world is the way it is now, and what kind of comes next. And this course really provided that. At the same time, not needing you to write academically was a huge plus. Being able to write journalistically, write in our own voice. I was really encouraged to write in my own voice, as opposed to having to write a set formula. All those things combined, that's what I wanted, and this course really provided that. And so I went all in, and here we are, a year and a bit later, and it really has set me on a path which I'm very, very happy with. Happier than I actually imagined was going to be possible. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And Thomas, you were talking about the syllabus. Maybe we can ask the faculty members to talk a bit about how the syllabus develops. It's a 2-semester program, fall and spring, and Nick and Sandro split. So one is teaching in the fall, usually Sandro, in the spring, Nick. How do you develop the syllabus, and what kind of topics will students usually dive into over the course of the 9 months they're here?
Well, it's interesting because I've now been teaching the MA Politics for, I guess, 17 or 18 years, and the world has changed drastically since then. So there are certain things that have remained constant in the syllabus, but many things change, and I redo it every year. Unfortunately, things like neo-authoritarianism wasn't a big issue in 2005. Right-wing populism was not a phenomenon. Now there's been like a lot of very good scholarship on those things. Democratic backsliding was not an issue, so we now have segments on those. I think we didn't appreciate the importance of race and gender to the extent that we do now, post Me Too, post Black Lives Matter. So all those things kind of have filtered their way into into the syllabus. But things that have kind of remained constant that seem obvious but are very far from obvious, like the creation of the modern nation state, why it is that all the societies in the world that are in the United Nations are organized in a certain way with a central capital, with recognized borders and an international order. And then when you realize that this is in fact a relatively recent thing, that most of human societies took a very different shape for most of human history, and understanding why this particular type of state ended up prevailing, then acts as a kind of springboard to take you into very journalistic questions like, why certain states, particularly, for example, that have been under colonization, took a very different direction and have a different shape to them. Why oil producing states function differently than those without the dependence on natural resources. We look at things like nationalism, which is, for better or worse, remained an incredibly powerful force in the world. And again, to kind of put that in historical perspective, the idea that people would kill or die for a nation is a quite modern idea. And it was something that wouldn't have made sense to people in the Middle Ages or in many parts of the world until the last 100 years or so. And so to kind of understand how those identities are formed and why they're so tenacious once they are formed is really kind of important for then having our students report on ethnic and religious conflict, on national conflict. I'm about to start a segment in which we're doing work on social movements, and so how it is that people begin to express their grievances collectively and promote causes, and those things take a very specific shape, and it's very helpful to kind of learn how to decode those kind of things that we sort of mostly work on a common sense basis, that people are unhappy about something and therefore they protest, but it's much more complicated than that. And there's a whole kind of repertoire of protest actions that people have developed over the last 200 years that gets constantly renewed with new kinds of movements that add on to those repertoires. And so looking at that, I think, becomes really, really interesting. How Chilean feminists developed a dance to denounce rape and things like that fit into a whole history of the way in which protest has worked in the modern world. So those are the kinds of things we do in the fall, that is, and then Nick takes over for the spring semester.
Yeah, so in the spring, we focus mostly on institutions. Fall is more sort of what I would call master concepts. And in the spring, we cycle through, legislatures and heads of state and interest groups and, on and on and on. And the construct is I have spent most of my career reporting on American politics, not all, but most. I tend to use the US as a primary example. Most of our students tend to be not from the US in the politics concentration. This year, I think none are from the US. So, in a way, it's a primer on how the US works, but I really don't mean the spring to be a course on American politics. It's a course, every institution we cover exists everywhere. Um, and we go comparative a lot, often in the readings and always through the participation of the students who come from all over. So we're all sort of educating ourselves and each other about the non-local implications of the issues. But we basically, what we do for the semester is spend the time cycling through institutions, but they're not institutions that only exist in the US. They're institutions that exist wherever you're from. And then we have 3 assignments, which I try to keep relatively light because in the spring, the students are also doing a thesis project. But the assignments are meant to make you think differently from the way political journalists usually think. They're sort of they're journalistic, as Professor Stila said, but they're kind of a forcing mechanism to consider things that, political journalism doesn't conventionally consider enough.
Mhm. Great. And Thomas, looking back on the politics seminars that you were in, are there any topics or sessions that really stand out as you look back as being really eye-opening or really, rewarding for you?
So what I will say first off is I never got the pleasure of Nick teaching because that year he was away.
Right, I was on sabbatical, so sorry about that.
Yeah, so you guys will get that, and from the other years I've spoken to, it's just amazing. I got Steve Coll instead, and we were also, but that was also interrupted by the war in Ukraine, and there was kind of a bit of a pivot to talk about our seminar through the prism of what was going on in Ukraine at the time. So I'm assuming that doesn't happen every year, although who knows. Something that really stuck out to me, and I've read this book twice more since Sandro's class, is King Leopold's Ghost. And just the way that book explains so much of what went on across a whole continent and the abuse perpetrated by my country and many other countries. And just the way that book is just like this amazing example of journalism, but done like hundreds of years ago. And it's so narrative, it gets to like the narrative nonfiction that we really covet and that we really want to bring out of this class. As Sandra was saying, this kind of amazing thing of learning how the nation state has kind of been formed was really interesting as well. You come in with assumptions of how democracy was born the way it was, and it turns out there's many different kinds. Like in the second half of the year there was a great conversation about the differences between a parliamentary democracy and a constitutional democracy. UK parliamentary, here constitutional, and it was so interesting to hear again, as Sandra and Nick have said, we have people from all over the world in the class, like all over the world, and to hear the different types of democracies we all have and the similarities, the differences, how it all worked was so interesting, and also hear our views on each other's democracies, the bits we liked, disliked, and how there's no perfect model. And we dove into that for 2-3 hour seminars, and we could have gone on for another 7 years. It was so fascinating. And then there's the guests. We had Zeynep Tufekci in, and she's just epic. She's so interesting. Her understanding of populism, of movements in the digital age. It was amazing just to have her in and for her to just talk to us. And even faculty from within the school as well coming and speak to us as well. Like Dean Coll, before he was dean, coming and sitting and talking to us about movements too. It was amazing. But yeah, the big downside for me was we didn't get Nick.
Sorry.
You guys will. Yeah.
Great. And I'm going to go back to something, Thomas, you were talking about in your earlier, answer to a question was about coming to the program for your writing skills to improve on that. And I thought we didn't talk about that yet. We talked a lot about the kind of intellectual engagement and discussions that go on in the program. But maybe Sandro and Nick, you could talk a bit about how you work with students also in terms of giving feedback on the written assignments to help people really improve in terms of their storytelling and reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I give 3 significant writing assignments in the fall, but I have everyone do 3 drafts of all 3 stories, because one of the things I think that people don't get enough of in the working world is really close editorial feedback. And so they're really busy, they're meeting deadlines, their editors are slamming things into print or putting them online as quickly as possible. And there isn't time to really reflect on what you're doing. And so I do a lot of close line editing of students' work. And we also, 3 times during the semester, will hold workshop sessions where we'll break the class into groups of generally 5 students and spend like an hour and a half, those 5 of us, going through those stories very, very carefully and picking them apart. So I think that makes a big difference. I think it's one of the things that students most appreciate in the course and in the program, is that kind of close attention to their writing. And I think it yields dividends for them.
Do you want me to speak about that too, or should we
Yes.
keep?
Yeah, you wanted to add or?
Well, just that I don't do 3 drafts of each assignment. I do workshops, and one reason I don't do 3 drafts is because everybody's got the thesis deadline hanging over their head, and they just need to spend time on that. But what's really important about the assignments is that they're meant to be a way to take non-journalistic research material and blend it into something that is recognizably and a high level work of journalism. So everything is about more larger context than there is in most journalism, and so for example, I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. Has anybody on the screen ever read War and Peace? If you read War and Peace, Ali, did you get all the way through his theory of history at the end? Okay, so that's my inspiration for what I call a Tolstoy profile. He sort of says, he goes on this rant that is very shocking to journalists, where he says, individuals have no effect on the course of history, which is, very upsetting to us because we're trained to have the opposite theory. So the assignment is essentially write a profile of an actual individual in politics, which is what we all do, that would sort of pass muster with Tolstoy if he were still with us, by not over attributing superhuman powers to that person and showing how they exist in a context of larger forces. And so that's one of the assignments. Another assignment is called the Why Things Changed assignment. And it's, sometimes there'll be a situation that seems fairly stable, and then suddenly, boom, it changes. And that's meant to make you understand that, there's a whole bunch of forces in a kind of balance in a political situation. And so when something changes, something happened to get them out of balance. I mean, an example right now, of course, is what's going on in the Middle East, where, 1 month and 3 days ago, Israel and many others thought Hamas is not an active, violent participant anymore, for various reasons, including, we've have this program through Qatar to, keep everything at bay. And all of a sudden, that's obviously not true. And then, so to ask the question, well, what changed other than Hamas staged an attack? What changed in the larger sense? And there's interesting answers to that question. So I want to sort of train people to think like that as they understand political events going by, not ignoring the events, but to understand them more richly.
Just getting back to Thomas for a second, how was that workshopping experience for you when you were doing, writing and working on those drafts? Was that helpful as you?
It was. I think like I'm trying to remember what my last assignment was. I think we did something on elections instead of doing the profile in the end with Steve Paul. But anyway, that aside, like the feedback sessions were amazing because you could like get perspectives you would never otherwise have heard. You could get advice. What was really special was, it was a bit scary at first having people. Again, I come from a broadcast background, so having people reading stuff I've written and the sheer level of the people in the room. I always thought I was the stupidest person in the room. We all think we're the stupidest person in the room, and just getting that feedback from people, and like it was so there was a real kind of camaraderie to it and like a togetherness. And as long as you were really open to hearing the feedback, it was never critical. It was constructive. It was friendly. It was helpful. I did really enjoy in the first in the fall semester the kind of group of five kind of thing, and the three drafts with the same group kind of going through it, because then you got to go along on the journey with each other, and you got to kind of see how to write a really strong nut graph. Like that was my weakness at the start, and there were some people we all no one their first everyone's first draft is terrible. And what happens is over time we really get better. And I think of the last one, the social movements one, I did it on this group called Insulate Britain, who, the way they protest, they want to have better insulation for environmental reasons, for cost saving reasons. And their model for what they do is they purposefully disrupt and they purposefully annoy, and for want of a better word, I'll just say frustrate. I'll say frustrate. They frustrate people. And it was so interesting that I was struggling to get that message across. And one of my classmates, Zeba, just made it she said, you just need to state in one sentence exactly what they do and why they do it. It's like their aim is not to get people on side by being reasonable. They're being unreasonable to make it so you can't ignore and avoid them. And that really stuck with me. And that's really changed my approach to any protest movement. Like, so many protest movements, what they do it to draw attention, and that can be in a negative or a positive way. Like Just Stop Oil, the way they do it as well, like, really annoys a lot of people, but it gets us talking about it. And all they want in the end is for people to talk about why they're doing it. Those feedback sessions were really transformative for me for thinking about how to direct a story writing, like hugely.
It's funny, I was thinking about your story, Thomas, as I was preparing to teach social movements tomorrow, and looking up videos of Uncut Britain, which is also a similarly very active, disruptive climate group that recently like attacked the Rokeby Venus in the British Museum in the National Gallery, and as an approach to drawing attention to an issue, doing something that's sort of purposely outrageous and annoying, but that actually gets people's attention as a social media as a social movement strategy. So I was thinking about your story on Insulate Britain.
Very cool. And so for our faculty, Nick and Sandro, we can talk a bit about another project that is kind of independent of all of what we've been talking about, the master's thesis, which is something that all students in all the different MA concentrations will do a longer work of, ambitious journalism. How do you work with students, and how does our kind of advising, faculty work with our students to develop those projects?
Well, this is an opportunity for students to really stretch their legs. Many of the students may not have done stories longer than 2,000, 2,500 words. And we have students do stories that can be handed in between 8,000 and 12,000 words, which is a very ambitious goal. And even though we know that will be longer than many will be able to publish their pieces, we feel there's a value in their understanding what it takes to do something that will sustain people's interest for that long. You have to think differently about structure. You have to have a narrative strategy to be able to write a piece of that length. You have to put something very special into the writing and the authorial voice of a story to draw someone along for that kind of length. And so, I like to tell my students that this is an opportunity for you to write the best story that you've ever written. And that should be your ambition. You shouldn't settle for anything less than that. And I think the students really love that opportunity. In many cases, they've been itching to go deeper and further in their work and have been frustrated by, deadlines and the pressures of the workplace. They may have been mulling over certain things that they haven't had a chance to work on, and that this gives them a chance to work on. So it ends up being a very, very rewarding project. I've seen students who launched into directions that were completely new to them, that did not worked on before. I mean, I had a student several years ago, Jacob Kushner, who decided he wanted to do something in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He didn't know French. He'd never been to Africa. He raised money to make the thing. He's now living in Kenya and has done a ton of reporting from Africa, and it's really, really enriched his working life. I had a student last year who is Italian, but wanted to do a story on the oppression of LGBTQ people in Iran. It was too complicated to go to Iran because there were violent protests and it was just very dangerous. But he figured out a way to do the story by locating a community of Iranian LGBT refugees that were stuck in Turkey, and they were all concentrated in one particular city in Turkey. He went there and interviewed them and just did a terrific story about these people who have just an incredibly tragic odyssey from their homeland in Iran, who are sort of stuck in an intermediate position in Turkey, hoping to emigrate to somewhere else. So those sort of examples of people doing, things that were just very, very different than anything you'd been able to attempt before.
Great. And I think we'll open up to questions shortly, but I wanted to ask about what happens after you graduate from the program. Sandra, can you talk a bit about where?
Can I just say one little PS about the thesis project? We can't guarantee it, but we usually are pretty good about providing travel funds to students. So I would say almost all of the thesis projects that we produce in the program are done non-locally, and often involve really far-flung and ambitious travel that people do during the winter break. So we made a map once, but we've produced thesis projects from all over the world. And it's kind of amazing that given everything else everybody's doing, they can also do original international reportage and produce these long pieces that, as Sandra said, are usually the longest work of journalism they've ever done. And, not all, certainly, but a lot of them have been published in prominent places over the years, too.
Great. So then the question about what happens when you finish the program. The program's been around for many years now. Where have some of our MA Politics grads gone on to report for or write for? And it's a good distinguished list for sure, but maybe just a few of those would be helpful to kind of understand.
Well, yeah, I mean, you name it, and just about all the, at least Anglophone prominent news organizations in the world have somebody from our program who's either freelanced for them or worked as a staff writer for them. They're kind of all over the place. They've worked for the Washington Post, they've worked for the New York Times, they've worked for the Wall Street Journal, they've worked for the New Yorker, they've worked for the Atlantic, they've worked for the Guardian. They, you see,
Yeah.
Thomas's shirt gives you a little hint.
Yeah, I mean, if I think of just the last few years, we have Ben Taub, who's a full-time writer for the New Yorker. Casey Parks is now at the Washington Post. She wrote a book that she began when she was in at the J School, and it's also published in pieces in the New Yorker. Willa Remus from a number of years ago is at the Washington Post doing technology coverage. Tess McClure, who's from New Zealand, is now writing from New Zealand, but for the Guardian. So we have a really, we could staff quite a publication with the people that have come through the program. It would be a dynamite publication if we were able to do that. So it's been an enormous satisfaction, I think, to all of us to see these people develop and grow in the way that they have, and just do some of the most exciting work in our field, I think.
And Thomas, so yes, we saw your shirt, but can you tell us a bit about what you're doing now and how you've taken advantage also, I guess, of your classmates and the work that you do that are also doing great reporting? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll just piggybacking off them for a second. Like, you know, if you just take my year, like 2022, as an example, you have so many have gone on to do amazing things already. You have, you know, Jason Armesto. He works for the Charlotte Observer, and he works on democracy and local issues down there. Really interesting. You have Emily Rose, who is Reuters correspondent in Jerusalem, who is leading coverage there at a critical moment. Hesha Majid, who is the Saudi Arabia correspondent for Reuters. Zeba Warsi, who is the international producer for PBS NewsHour. Aya Ibrahim, she is the special correspondent for DW. That's just from that's just 5 of my friends from a course of, I think, was it 18 of us? I mean, it was, you know, it's just incredible. Just, you know, just from that small sample size. And there's others doing so many other amazing things, you know, as well. Me, I'm now a producer with NPR's Here and Now. It's their midday kind of news radio show. The radio host I work with the most is Deepa Fernandez, who was a graduate from the first year of the course.
Yeah.
So we have now ended up working together. It's very funny to talk about both of you so many years apart in the course. And yeah, it's just incredible to see where we'll end up. For me, yeah, I'm working here on production, seeing how this course is like kind of changed me. How do I put this? It's really vastly improved my writing for our digital copy, which is a side piece of what I do, but it's also just improved my ability to get to the crux of the story in the lead of an interview very quickly. My pitching ability, like the stories I pitch here at work, I have a very high approval rate for stories that are more features based than maybe the average producer, because I was taught how to really know what a really good pitch is. Like, you know, when it comes to your assignments in class, you'll kind of spitball a few ideas. And, you know, the very simple like question that I think it was you, Sandra, who asked me, is like, okay, but what is the critical question you're answering with this piece you're pitching to me? And if you cannot answer that with a question that's really compelling, this is not a big story. And that was something I really learned and I've really taken forward. And it's just my pitch rate here being improved is sky high, you know, compared to what it would have been before. And I get to direct as well. You know, it gave me a newfound confidence in my ability as a journalist. It's been transformative, and I've ended up in a job. Honestly, I can't believe how lucky I am to work at NPR. I thought it was going to take me years to get to this point. I thought it was going to take me years, and this course really accelerated me to this point. And I'm just so gracious for everything I learned, the people I met, and yeah, all those people I mentioned, and you know, who gone to do amazing things. Them and many of my other colleagues, Ava, who you know covers this, you know, SDNY for Bloomberg in New York. You know, I've had her on to talk about Sam Bankman-Fried. I've had all those people on as guests on the show, and you know, and I know that some of them collaborate on stories, and so you get that never-ending community too. It's just awesome. It's just great.
Great. I see some questions here, but before that, I'll ask a big question as people are watching this now or watching this in the future on our recording, and they're really interested in this program and based on what you've been hearing and they want to apply. For Sandra and Nick, what do you look for in a strong application to this particular program as people start to compose their materials or think about what the right fit is for them?
First, you know, I've spent X% of my life writing about higher ed admissions. So we do what is known in the trade as authentic assessment. That is, the two of us and Ross and a couple other people read every application in full. And we don't require any standardized tests except for TOEFL for non-native English speakers. And, you know, the thing I look at the most is just the quality of the work and the promise it shows. And then we assign several essays and personal statements and things like that. So that's what we require transcripts from undergraduate. But I spend most of my time as a application reader looking at what you've written and what you say about yourself.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think we want to be sure that the students have enough, or the applicants have enough journalistic experience that we're confident they know they know the basics of journalism and that we don't have to teach that to them. So that's one thing that kind of helps us separate serious candidates from ones that we're likely maybe to suggest they apply to the MS program instead. And then beyond that, as Nick said, I think you want to have writing, but you also want to see intellectual curiosity, people who are going to be engaged by the kind of teaching that we do and are going to get something out of this program. And I always look a lot at the personal essays and at the essays, because that's a situation in which you're completely free to write as you choose. Some people may have been working for a daily newspaper with a very limited kind of format that may hem the writer in, and so they may not have been able to express themselves as freely as they might. So in your essays, you really have an opportunity to actually show who you are and how you can write. And often we see, very good work in the published work that's submitted, that you read that and you just know, yes, this person can definitely do this program and do it very well. So I think those are sometimes you see academic transcripts and you see somebody who struggles for the first 2 years, but they were like forced to study chemistry because their parents wanted them to, and then they switched to something else, and suddenly their transcript got better. So we don't look as much at the GPA as we would at the whole picture, I think.
Yeah, we got a couple questions kind of related to that. Somebody was wondering if you have any thoughts for a person that might be applying who's worked mainly in the politics side of things, working for government, working as like a speechwriter in a government setting, maybe hasn't done a lot formally in media. Would that be somebody you would advise for this program, or maybe for the MS in those cases?
Well, I mean, I would say we have a trust us policy. That is, regularly we will read an application and say this person belongs in the MS program, is better suited for. And, often they'll say, yeah, you're right. And they'll go to the MS program and have a good experience. I'd say what I would want to see is if you're thinking, I've never interviewed anybody and never done direct reporting and never had to write a sort of basic story quickly and cleanly, you might be better off in the MS program. We originally designed this to be a kind of optional second year for MS students, and in the first couple of years, a lot of the students chose to stay another year. But it's just, we're not in a position to sort of, it's not set up for us to teach you, the basics of how to write a story inside a conventional news cycle.
Yeah, we've made a couple of exceptions. We've sometimes had
Yeah.
people who, let's say, worked in the NGO world, and so they did significant writing, but it wasn't for a conventional media publication. And so if that person has done enough writing and they're able to win us over, we've made a couple of exceptions, but generally people have worked in media for at least a few years.
Great. And then a question about the writing samples or the work samples that people would upload. We asked for 3 work samples. We've talked a little bit about that. Question about kind of what you look for in that. And also for somebody who maybe has written some very long pieces, would you prefer that they kind of give an excerpt of that? Because I think we have a 15-page maximum for all the 3 samples in our application. Or would you rather them choose like shorter pieces instead that are fully complete in terms of what the story is?
I don't know what this software can handle. I mean, I prefer to read longer than shorter, because it just kind of gives you a better sense of.
Yeah, and we can then always just, I mean, if we don't want to get to page 20 of a story,
Send us a link.
you can read as much of it to get a sense of what the quality of the reporting and the quality of the writing is. So if you like a particular piece and you feel it represents you the best, submit it and we'll figure it out. One thing that is I've sometimes found tricky is when people have worked in broadcast, it can be hard to tell what somebody's contribution to a story is. And so if you're submitting things in which you've written the script, or it's not just somebody conducting an interview with a famous person where the journalist asks 3 questions and the other person talks for 5 minutes, though that's not generally very helpful in terms of our evaluating how this person is and what their training is as journalists. So keep in mind that we want to be able to see and identify and evaluate your contribution to something. And so there are, of course, broadcast pieces in which the person has, reported and written the script, and that functions very well. But otherwise, it can be tricky.
Great. And Thomas, is somebody who applied and was accepted. Do you have any advice just in terms of how you approached the application when you were doing this?
Yeah, I really made sure to prioritize I had done some writing. I'd done some, writing. I think it was maybe 2,000 words. So I made sure to prioritize those in the application. What else? I've advice for if people get onto the course. People should really, just in those personal essays, really, really write in your own voice. Don't write for what you think someone wants to read. Write for what you want them to read. Like, if you try and fit into some sort of structure, I'm sure that there are templates out there on Google to tell you how you should write to this, that. Ignore that. You need to write as yourself, or else you're not going to be approved, because these guys can see through that. They know when you're writing in your voice. And so the most important thing is to write honestly to yourself. My writing was very raw, but it was honest. And I'd like to hope that was part of why I ended up being accepted onto the course.
Great.
I mean, one of the complicated things about what we do is, like, why does Professor Steele write about Italy? Did he just stick a pin in a map and say, gee, that looks like an interesting place? No, his parents are from Italy. So, I mean, all of us have, especially sort of ambitious nonfiction, we have things that happen to us, experiences in our own lives and backgrounds that draw us to certain topics more than other topics. And that comes through in the essays. But what we're looking for is, if somebody essentially says, what I look for is, I think it's good if you say, I had X experience and that's given me a passion to report on Y. But if you say, I want to be a memoir writer, that throws me off a little bit. And if you say, I really want to be an activist on this subject more than a journalist, that throws me off a little bit. Those lines get blurry in a lot of ways, but I like if somebody's experience gives them a special passion to report on something, but I want to see evidence that they actually do want to report on it.
Great advice. I know we're running to the end of this. One more question we got in the chat that was interesting about someone who's maybe working in more local journalism or local political reporting. How might the program help them if they want to maybe get into more national or international politics reporting, kind of moving into a larger kind of context for their reporting?
I'd love to answer that one because I've seen such really interesting examples of it. A couple of years ago, in fact, in Thomas's class, we had Jason Ernesto, who had done local reporting, I think in New Jersey, for New Jersey television, and nothing really beyond that. And I remember in his first assignment in our class, he said he wanted to write about femicide in Mexico, killing of women. And I said, well, do you know Spanish? He said, no. I thought, okay, this could be interesting. How's this going to work? And because he had really good reporting chops that he developed doing local reporting, he knew how to report a story, even though he'd not reported a foreign story. And to his credit, he found people in Mexico to talk to him. He found NGOs that represented women who were victims of violence. He found professors in the US who were Mexican who understood that problem, and he produced a really good story. And so that to me, and then he really made a leap into a more ambitious kind of journalism than he'd practiced before. And I think partly on the strength of that and other pieces, he ended up getting an internship at the BBC. So more international than the BBC you couldn't really get. He then decided he really wanted to do print. And so he's now working in North Carolina, but that was a choice that he made. Thomas, you.
Yeah, actually, it's so funny you were saying Jason, because I was thinking him as well. He's one of my best mates in the course, and like local journalism is, to me, I think actually maybe the most important journalism, because so often what's happening at the local level is indicative of what is happening everywhere else in the country. And I find that the acting chops of people like Jason and others who had done a lot of local stuff, like even Ava had done a lot of local stuff in Australia. Just within states, and they just knew how to pursue any story. And I think with this course, yeah, you're looking at more national or international stuff, but every story starts small and gets big. That's how it starts, and they were really good at starting their story small and letting it grow from there. They're really good at being focused on the issue, as opposed to maybe some of the rest of us who would need more national focus for a while. We go big picture too quickly, and it's the best way to get someone hooked in the story is to start with the smallest, the one person who you really want to care about, and say they're not the only one, they're one of many. And those guys were so good at that, and yeah, like with your thesis, I thought personally a lot of the best theses I read were ones which focused on local stuff. Like his thesis was, if I remember, he was focusing on ballot boxes and election interference issues in, I want to say, Pennsylvania. And he really focused in on one specific county, and it told the story of an entire country grappling with democracy. It was such a tool. It was such a weapon for him to be an amazing journalist, and he's going to continue to be an amazing journalist. And there are many stories like that. I think the colleagues whose pieces I'd love to read were the ones who could do that. So really take that superpower of knowing how to be a local reporter and really use that as a tool.
Great advice. And I know we're running out of time, but Thomas, one last question for you to wrap up. What advice do you have for people who might be considering this program now about how to make the most out of it? Or
where to begin? Really do the readings. There were a few weeks, I will not lie, and Sandra can probably attest to this, where I'd maybe clearly not done the readings. And I suffered for it. I really did. It's more interesting, it's more exciting, it's more fun when you've really read and you can keep up in those conversations people are having around you. Also, electives, you get to do 1 in the first term, 2 in the second term, if I recall the correct way around. Once you're accepted onto the course, and once you have access to your Columbia Lion Mail, etc., really dive into options that you can do for your elective courses. Email those professors and ask them for the syllabus. Ask them if they accept students from the J School. Also get the advice of the professors. That really helps with where you might want to focus. I loved my electives so much. I was really lucky. I think some people hadn't done that same thing, and their enjoyment of electives wasn't the same level as mine. For the thesis, have a lot of ideas coming in for what you might want to do with the thesis, but be prepared for them to say maybe not, and you to pivot. Like, don't be heartbroken or discouraged by that. You will have a good thesis at the end of it all. Trying not to center yourself in the thesis is important. I think a lot of us came in trying to write a story that was kind of pseudo about us. Find something that interests you but isn't fully about you. Maybe it touches an area of interest, something about you a bit. Make sure it's an area of interest but not about you. Is my thought on that. And yeah, just enjoy it. Honestly, you're going to be surrounded by classmates from all over the world. It's really cool. You get so many different viewpoints and things, and they're all as valid as each other.
great. That's a great way to kind of end the conversation. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you, Professors Nicholas Lemon, Alexander Stilla, for this great conversation about the MA Politics. And the nice thing for people watching this right now or watching in the next few days is that there's still a good amount of time to put together an application for this particular program. The deadline for the 24-25 academic year will be January 5th. So still, over, almost 2 months to kind of get this together. So you can always reach out to our office at apply.journalism@columbia.edu with any questions you have about the application process and about the scholarship application process. So all those conversations can keep on going, and use plenty of time, I think, to determine what program is the right fit for you, and if this is the right one, to put together a strong application, hopefully based on the advice and the recommendations from our panelists today. But thank you again for attending. Thank you to our participants, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Have a good rest of your day or your evening, wherever you are.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.